Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this joint event being held by the Wiener Holocaust Library and René Cassin. I'm Barbara Warnock from the Wiener Holocaust Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here tonight to talk about this very important and topical subject of forced labour and genocide then and now. As I've said, the Wiener Holocaust Library is doing this event in conjunction with René Cassin, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. And we've partnered with René Cassin before on issues of mutual interest. And for those who don't know, the Wiener Holocaust Library is the world's oldest archive of material on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. And so we're a very appropriate place to hold this event tonight on forced labour and genocide. We have documents relating to the persecution of Jews in Roma and the genocide carried out against Jews in Roma. And we specifically have documents about Nazi policies of forced labour and accounts in our collections relating to survivors of Nazi forced labour as well. So a very appropriate place to be holding this event, looking at the situation in the past in Nazi-occupied Europe, and also focusing on the situation in China today in relation to the Uyghur community. So we've got a very busy programme tonight, so I'm not going to say much more, just a couple of words of housekeeping. If you would like to use the closed caption facility to get subtitles, that should be switched on. So on the bottom of your screen, you should see a button which allows you to switch that on and off. Tonight's event is being recorded, but only speakers will actually be recorded. So it'll just be the speakers on the recording, but just to let you know that that is happening. There will be a little bit of time at the end for question and answers from the audience. If you have any questions at the end, you can put them in the chat. The chat at the moment is set up so your questions will come to the hosts of the event. So the hosts of the event will be able to see your questions and put them to the panel. So I'm now going to hand over to Mia Hassenson-Gross, the director of René Cassin. Mia joined René Cassin in 2015, and before that she worked for Amnesty International as International Projects Advisor, where she acquired in-depth knowledge of international human rights work and experience in human rights education, campaigning and organisational development. Prior to joining the staff at Amnesty, she was managing director of the Hanan Iowa Foundation for Ethiopian Immigrant Students at Jerusalem and was chairperson of Amnesty International's Israel section. Mia is now a fellow of Dangor Senior Leadership Programme and is a graduate fellow of the Miniver Centre for Human Rights at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So I'll hand you over to Mia to say more about the event tonight and also to introduce our panel of speakers. Mia.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and lovely to see everyone this evening. René Cassin, we work to promote and protect universal rights drawing on Jewish values and Jewish experience. And we take our name from Monsieur René Cassin, who co-drafted the Universal Declaration for Human Rights in the aftermath of the Holocaust, and the idea that never again can the persecution and the suffering and the genocide that the Jewish people experienced should be experienced by others. So we, the Jewish community, Jewish people, we see ourselves as speakers by experience that carry the moral authority, but also with it the moral duty to act, to speak out, to stand in solidarity and support other groups or other individuals experiencing what we have in the not so distant past and going back 5,000 years with forced labor in Egypt. Over 12 million civilian laborers, prisoners of war and concentration camp prisoners were brought to Germany as forced laborers in the course of World War II. Also in occupied territories, including Alderney and Guernsey Channel Islands, millions of men, women and children were forced to work for the enemy, including 10,000 Jews that were brought from Soviet Union mainly. forced labor during the Holocaust is well documented, and Barbara spoke of the evidence, and that's available in the library. And so is there evidence, documentation, and testimonies to show for the more recent forced labor of Uyghur Muslims by the Chinese Communist Party in the Xinjiang region of China and across China itself. In both instances, the evidence is indisputable. In both instances, forced labor is linked to genocide and persecution of a people. In some cases, it's even the same company collaborating with the oppressing forces. The strongest example is, of course, Volkswagen, a company that in the 1940s operated 4 concentration camps and 8 forced labor camps on its property and actively sought out forced labor from the concentration camp system. A company that today has a factory in Urumqi, the heart of Xinjiang region, where the suffering of Uyghur people is most prolific, and whose component supplier, or at least one of its component suppliers, is using thousands of Uyghur forced laborers in their factories as part of the poverty alleviation programs. The similarities are worrying, their conclusion fatal. That is why we are delighted to host this evening this great panel of speakers to help us learn and understand about the realities of forced labor during Nazi and current era, the human implications, and why they are worrying precursors to genocide. Our first speaker is Professor Johannes Dieter Steinert, as Professor of Modern European History and Migration Studies at the University of Wolverhampton. His research interests focus on German, British, and European social and political history, with special emphasis on international migration and minorities, forced migration, survivors of Nazi persecution, international humanitarian assistance, and child forced labor in Nazi Germany and German-occupied East Europe. Dr. Adrian Zenz is one of the world's leading scholars on the People's Republic of China, government policies towards the country's western regions of Tibet and Xinjiang. Research performed by Dr. Zenz in 2017 and 18 played a significant role in bringing to light the Chinese government's campaign of repression and mass internment directed against the ethnic Uyghur people in Xinjiang, including testifying about the state exploitation of labor incarcerated Uyghurs, and a report from June 2020 on the mass forced sterilization of Uyghur women. Rahima Mahmood is the director of the World Uyghur Congress UK office and of the Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign. She's a human rights defender, but most importantly, an artist who thrives on the richness of the Uyghur music and poetry of her Uyghur culture, and who I feel privileged to call a friend. Rahima has lived in the UK since 2000, and her translation of The Land Drenched in Tears, a first-hand account of life for ethnic minorities in Mao's China, won English Penn's Writers in Translation Award. And last but not least, Joe Collins, currently undertaking a Master's of Law. His undergraduate dissertation critically reviewed the dolus specialis, if I pronounce it correctly, special intent to destroy for the crime of genocide, and challenged the ability of the Genocide Convention to adequately respond to modern atrocity. Joe has been a regional ambassador for the Holocaust Education Trust since 2017, and has recently co-founded a youth-led initiative, Yet Again, which is committed to raising awareness of and increasing knowledge of modern atrocity. Each of our speakers will speak for about up to 10 minutes, and at the end of which we will have a short panel discussion, we mentioned, linking between forced labor policies and genocidal policies and realities, after which we will open it up for questions and answers. Dieter, please, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much. Works. Thank you very much, Mia, for your very kind introduction. And I will try to stick to the 10 minutes you have generously given me for a very huge topic on forced labor in National Socialist Germany. And you have already mentioned the main figures that between 1939 and 1945, during the Second World War, Germany deployed a total of 8.4 million civilian forced laborers from outside Germany, 4.6 million prisoners of war, and 1.7 million concentration camp prisoners, a total of perhaps 13.5 million, including just over 1 million double countings. These figures are according to a German colleague, Mark Spörer. In my own research, I'm struggling with the technique. In my own research on child forced laborers carried out during the last 15 years, I have estimated that perhaps around 1 million Jewish children have been forced to work for the Germans before being liberated, or in most cases being murdered. Additionally, at least 1.5 million Polish and Soviet children have been deported as forced laborers to Germany during the war, and these are conservative estimations. Not surprisingly, in a state that was built on a racist ideology, the deportation, working and living condition of forced laborers was based on racist criteria as well. Worst off were workers from Eastern Europe, while those from North and Western European countries were in a much better position. At the bottom of the National Socialist racist hierarchy were four groups: Jews, Soviets, Poles, and Sinti and Roma. And these are the four groups I focus on in my own research on child forced laborers, with the last group being at the focus, Sinti and Roma children at the focus at my current research. During the war, forced laborers worked in all branches of industry, in mining, agriculture, and construction work. They were forced to build production plants, bridges, roads and railway tracks, barracks, airfields, defensive positions for the German military, and trenches. However, while it cannot be denied that forced labor played an increasingly important role for the German war economy, and the profit made filled business, commercial, public, and private coffers, it is worthwhile to have a look at the origins of forced labor in National Socialist Germany. And these origins point into the directions of early concentration camps and the National Socialist aim to establish a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community, a racially unified body. In order to reach this aim, the government operated with the tools of inclusion and exclusion. It was in this context that before the war, forced labor of German and Austrian Jews was regarded as a way to increase the pressure that would finally result in their emigration by making their life in Germany as unpleasant as possible. The social and economic exclusion was accompanied by a destruction of Jewish culture, humiliating the Jewish population in public by forcing them to work in columns and to exercise physically hard and dirty work was also a demonstration of power and the determination of the new regime to create a racially pure state. While according to the racist ideology, some groups were to be excluded from the Volksgemeinschaft, first by emigration, later by mass murder and genocide, there was a substantial amount of Germans whom the National Socialists wanted to include into the people's community after a process of re-education. This group consisted, among others, of political opponents, people who were regarded as work-shy or as socials, homosexuals, prostitutes, beggars, vagrants, alcoholics, etc. And their re-education was carried out in concentration camps, but also in labor educational camps with very harsh living and working conditions. Additionally, there was forced sterilization of those whom the regime regarded as unworthy to be a member of the new society, but should not be killed or should not be killed immediately. At the beginning of the war, forced labor did not play an essential role in the German war efforts, as German planners were convinced of short and successful military campaigns, and the demands on the German labor market could be filled mainly by prisoners of war. This attitude prevailed until autumn 1941, before it became obvious that the war against the Soviet Union did not go the German way and would last much longer than anticipated. Now, hundreds of thousands of Polish and Soviet citizens were deported from German-occupied areas in Eastern Europe. Polish and Soviet forced laborers made up more than half of all civilian forced laborers in Germany, and among them were 1.6 million Poles and nearly 2.8 million Soviets. And a huge proportion of them were women and children. Deportation characterized the reign of terror and German occupation policy in the East, but deportations also accompanied German anti-warfare, anti-partisan warfare, and the scorched earth policy exercised during the German retreat. As the war progressed and the German military retreat from the East was inevitable, and the success of Allied bombing in the West became obvious, German planners focused more and more on Jewish and non-Jewish concentration camp prisons. And it was in this context that National Socialist Germany, whose propaganda machinery over years had stressed the importance of Germany becoming Judenfrei, free of Jews, now deported Jewish forced laborers to German production plants, both overground and increasingly underground. In 1944 and early 1945, there was hardly a German firm and a German village and town without forced laborers and without a smaller or larger forced labor camp, mainly sub-camps of the major concentration camps. After the war, this chapter of German history was under-researched for many decades, be it that historians were more interested in political history than in social and economic history, or that the firms involved kept their archives closed for fear of compensation claims. It was only in the 1990s and under the threat of possible American class action suits that the German government and German firms started to realize that a voluntarily established compensation fund was the only way to avoid such claims. In 2000, a law on the creation of the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future passed the German parliament. The foundation's capital of 10 billion German marks, just over 5 billion euros, was made available in equal amounts by the German industry and the German federal government. However, the payments former forced laborers received between 2001 and 2007, also they often helped to meet some urgent needs, can hardly be regarded as compensation, let alone that individual suffering, traumatization and the loss of family members, the loss of education and the loss of individual life chances cannot be compensated. Now that the fear among German firms was gone, more and more firm archives opened their gates for historical research, and it is safe to say that forced labor in World War II belongs to the best researched areas in German history. It is, however, questionable that all German and international firms have learned from history, and I assume that tonight we will come back to this topic again and again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dieter. I think your final sentence is exactly the link to Adrian, who's going to, I have a guess, give us an eerily similar overview, only in a contemporary context. So Adrian, please.
Yes, thank you indeed for having me. And I think it really is a very chilling comparison to the Uyghur context. Now, I'm just trying to make sure that we are going to be looking at the right presentation here. And I'll be sharing my screen here. Okay. Yes, I also only have 10 minutes, and just to give a very brief overview, we're looking at the so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in northwestern China with about close to 12 million Uyghurs and nearly 15 million ethnic Turkic ethnic minorities who are affected by the crackdown in the region. And historically and culturally, the Uyghurs and many of the other ethnic minority groups in Xinjiang are very distinct from the Han Chinese. And of course, this has led to major problems and conflicts, historic and since Chinese takeover by Mao Zedong's armies in 1949, that I'll be glossing over here. Important watershed, of course, is the 2009 Urumqi riots, which you might have heard of, which in turn led to a drastically accelerated strategy of control and oppression by the Chinese state in the region. I've kind of given you an overview of three phases into which we can understand this. Firstly, there's sort of a police state strategy of police recruitments, surveillance systems, ramping up. Secondly, the mass internment in camps, 2017 to 19. And we are now seeing a shift of people being shifted from camps into forced labor or into sentenced to long-term prison sentences. So we are basically in the year 2021, we are looking at the long-term strategy now that Beijing is using to control the region and arguably destroy the cultures and the distinctiveness of the ethnic minority groups, with very concerning implications also for the population size. The long-term strategy consists of coercive labor, weaponized education, and intergenerational separation of parents and children, together with birth prevention and mass sterilization of Uyghur women. I'll be focusing on forced labor and its role. So under the guise of development, the Chinese state has instigated an industry-based poverty alleviation, which operates in many parts of China, but in Xinjiang, it has a particular significance. The ethnic minorities in particular are put into so-called poverty alleviation workshops. And this takes place under a labor transfer scheme by which many Uyghurs are agricultural surplus laborers, and they are being shifted from the primary primary sector into the secondary or tertiary sectors. So we're looking at Uyghur farmers in particular, or Kazakh farmers, being shifted into low-skilled labor-intensive manufacturing. Textile and garment production is at the forefront, and there's a plan to have 1 million workers in textile and garment industries by 2023. Also, of course, owing to the fact that Xinjiang is one of the world's largest growing areas for cotton. And of course, I've also documented forced labor in cotton picking, which I don't have the time in this presentation to go in detail, but it kind of works along the same ways. Electronics assembly, footwear, toys, furniture, handicrafts, low-skilled kind of industry, and labor transfers can take Uyghurs either to other parts of Xinjiang or other parts of China, or they remain locally employed. Poverty alleviation works according to a precision of fine-grained format. And this is just an example of an app whereby everybody is categorized. This whole, the wider forced labor scheme of the region is highly predicated upon a very securitized society, which shows some similarity in Nazi Germany, was also characterized by high social control, inceptual use of technology in that. And of course, here in Beijing, in China and Xinjiang in the 21st century, we're looking at a high-tech police state where everyone who can work must be put to work. You need to be in a government-approved place. The forced labor scheme has several components to it, the first of which is quite directly linked to the internment camps. Here you have in Karakash County in southern Xinjiang, a new factory complex built in 2018 and 19, right kind of surrounded by several internment camps. These kind of factory parks have sprung up in many sort of county and township seats in Uyghur regions where people are put to work, and people are also shifted there from internment camps to work. Now, the internment camp, I don't have time to go into detail, but internment camps also have factories on their own compounds itself, although some of them were probably for temporary use, for training. And we are now seeing sort of a longer term shifting of people into these factory complexes. This is some of the documentary evidence of a so-called re-education camp, poverty alleviation workshop with the budget, with the government documentation. So a lot of, like this one was 46 million Chinese yuan. It's about 7 or 8 million US dollars. Lots of over 30,000 square meters. So we had 16 factory blocks. So we're talking quite substantial settings here in terms of their size and capacity. The majority or the largest scheme of forced labor in Xinjiang operates besides, meaning on top of the the forced labor that's out of the internment camps. It's called the training of rural surplus laborers, and they can be trained in facilities like these, who are potentially semi-securitized vocational training schools that operate not dissimilar from internment camps in terms of their security and the military drill and the strictness and the ideological indoctrination, but they are time limited. People spend maybe 2 or 3 months in them. And it's like a camp system within society where you have forced labor produced through the system based on recruitment and other factors. A particular emphasis is the transfer of laborers to other parts. And we recently were able to obtain, and I'm not sure if this was even mentioned in an introduction to myself, to my person, I published a report in March this year on a Chinese academic research document called the Nankai Report, which gives unprecedented new insight into the nature and purpose of labor transfer, especially transfers that also bring Uyghurs to other parts of China. And this document specifically says that these labor transfers of Uyghurs are designed to reduce Uyghur population density in southern Xinjiang. So there's a really strong link to population-related goals, which of course go hand in hand with birth prevention and the separation of family units. Forced labor separates family units many times, not always. They can also be transported together sometime. Private enterprises are implicated. Huafu is one of the largest makers of dyed yarn, and they are implicated in the labor transfer system. Here you see women who are being trained to work in textile industries, going through the military drill training, which Huafu basically conforms to government regulations, but does the training by itself, including the political ideology. The staff must write essays and evaluations on political thought education. And the last component of the forced labor is the most intrusive. It is to bring the work to people's doorsteps. So this especially targets women who can't easily leave villages because they're caring for children or elderly. These are village satellite factories, small workshops in almost every other village in Xinjiang, which have attached nurseries. So kids who are too young for preschool, meaning they're younger than 3 or 4 years old, Even babies can be dropped off at a factory nursery, so the women can work all day. This is an example, just a mother of 3 kids, the youngest 13 months old, who has now been, her thoughts and mind have been changed, her family convinced, and she now works at a village satellite factory, and the kids are all taken care of by the state. This concludes my presentation. So we have basically a long-term strategy of forced labor, parent-child separation, birth prevention, and internment, and imprisonment increasingly. We have linkages documented of labor transfers to strategies of population thinning or population-related considerations, which of course highly concerning. We have, all in all, forced labor as one important component of the gradual or long-term destruction of Uyghurs as a group in the sense of the 1948 Convention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and for sharing, I guess, the current reality in Xinjiang. You said, you know, your final word is they're all part of the process to try to eliminate the Uyghur as a people or as a group. And that's why I'm delighted, Rahima, you are part of a group, but you are also an individual story, a story that sadly is probably repeated by too many Uyghur families in Xinjiang region and in exile. But yeah, if you want to share your story with us, give a bit of a face and the personal reality of what forced labor really means.
Thank you, Mia, and thank you for your very kind introduction in the beginning. This is so emotional, and it's really painful even to, you know, listen to previous two wonderful speakers, and then the comparison that what happened during the Nazi era and now. And I come from a very big, large family of 10, 11. My childhood was the latter years of Cultural Revolution. I listened to stories of people who died after being taken to camps. And I also vaguely remember my brothers used to disappear during, especially autumn time after the harvest, and I didn't come home like 2-3 months. Later I learned that they were taken also, it was forced labor, that they you know, dig irrigation system and build roads and whatever, that has been the case. And also one of my favorite songs that I often sing is the Tarim, is a song about the Tarim labor camp. It just reminds me of you know, what is happening now. And this is a lyrics I would like to just share. Farewell, loved ones, I have left for the banks of Tarim. Farewell, roses of my desire that I danced with growing up. I have left for the banks of Tarim, and tirelessly I shall labor. If you come to Tarim with flowers, with flowers, I shall adorn you. So we know Tarim is the biggest, one of the biggest notorious labor camp located in the middle of Taklamakan Desert. There is no possibility you can have these flowers and, you know, someone can adorn, you know, the loved one with flowers. But this song itself, this lyrics itself just reflects in such a metaphor that, you know, how sad the situation was at, you know, during the 60s and 70s. And I thought from the 80s, starting my secondary school, and we were free since the mosques reopened, and we gained relative freedom. You know, there was a great time, about 1 decade, 10 years of cultural and religious revival and the happy times. Then from early 90s, again, the persecution started, and it deteriorated year by year up until 1997. That was a final, the final decision that I made to leave my country. The Gholjah massacre, killing the peaceful protest, was crushed by a military, or killing over 100 Uyghurs in my hometown of Gholjah, and later followed by arrests, 5,000 arrests. And Amnesty International reported in its report in 1999, 195 execution, that peaceful protest. The organizers, anyone who they believe they involved in organizing this demonstration, were executed, and then followed by the new regulations. And throughout this time, actually, this when the liberties, the Uyghur people's liberty are restricted year by year, and when the Uyghurs' right, our own, the basic human rights taken away from us. And of course, it made it very convenient for the Chinese government to either detain or force Uyghurs to work. And that brief freedom during the 80s that we had, that we could all go to university and choose the job that we want to. But again, in late 90s, when I left in 2000, I remember my brother's sons, they graduated from university and they had to go to mainland China to work 1 year free, in the name of improving their Mandarin skills. And so that's how actually gradually developed. So forced labor, it's not a new thing. It's just that the scale has changed since 2016. You know, that this mass internment camps built, then when people woke up in 2018, only after the UN openly criticized China, saying that we acknowledge up to 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims interned in this so-called re-education camps. And followed by, we learned later, actually, at that time, we didn't know that the people were forced to work. But I believe from my own memory, we started to learn this large scale of forced labor in 2019. And there's one example I remember watching this a documentary, Tell the World. Tell the World. It was a sister of Australian Uyghur lady, and Dilnur Idris, and she was a qualified nurse who worked for years at the hospital in Urumqi, near the Xinjiang Medical University. And in February 2017, she and her husband were both arrested and sent to prison camps. And 3 months later, she was sent to work in a textile factory. And in June 2000, I believe it was 2019, she managed to take risk. She was allowed to go home once a month or once a week. It has 3 young children. So she phoned her sister in Australia and didn't say, but she wrote and then showed her writing on screen, which said, please help me. And said, if I can't get out of this place, you can tell the international community and the government, whatever you can do. So people were taking huge risk, want the world to know what what has been happening. And also one of the camp survivors, Gulzira Al-Khan, the Kazakh woman who's from the Gholjah region, from where I come from, And she also stated that after the internment camp, she was forced to work in a factory stitching gloves. And she said, they told us openly that the gloves will be sold abroad, so we should do a good job. So obviously they require whenever you, whatever product you export, the quality has to be extremely, extremely high. And therefore that's what she said, that the control was so strict, and the quality has to be top, because they constantly reminded us that these products are going to be exported to other European countries. So as I said, the entire, what is happening to the Uyghurs, to people like myself, even though I am living in this free country, but not being able to know what is happening to my own brothers and sisters, as I have cut off from my everyone since January 2017, and learning what's happening. And the latest report, the Sky News, Tom Cheshire also reported only weeks ago about the Chinese site Baidu selling Uyghurs on this advertising. And when the Sky News investigated this and phoned them up, and they said these people, they have to be examined politically, and and it has to be semi-military management. So I should stop now. I believe my time is up, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this from my personal perspective. And thank you, Mia.
Thank you, Rahima. It's, your story is the story of too many individuals today. And, right before Joe takes us through an understanding of what genocide means, Dieter, you said that at the core of forced labor during Nazi era was racist ideology. And it's racist ideology that's at the core of persecution and genocide. So Joe, it'd be really helpful if now we understood what genocide is, and then we can combine the two in a follow-up conversation.
Thank you, Mia. I'll share my screen because it's always helpful with slides when you've got longer definitions. So as Mia said, I'll be looking at the legal framework on genocide, but I would also like to very briefly touch upon the way in which forced labour would fit into that framework, because it can start to get quite complicated in international law. And the one thing that I would emphasise from the outset is that in understanding genocide and in understanding its relationship with forced labour, I would caution against looking at it through a legal lens. The reason being, I think, will become clear in a moment. But just from the off, I very much emphasise that the law and a legal lens is not a perfect way in which to understand, I think, atrocity. But to start with, what is genocide? Contrary to, I think, popular belief, particularly when campaigning on the Uyghur genocide, genocide is not just mass killing. Naturally, many genocides throughout our history have been perpetrated in this way, but it is not just mass killing. And I've put the definition from Article 2 of the Genocide Convention on the board. Sorry, board, we're not in person, screen is better. It is probably best to view this into two components. First, the genocidal acts, the physical acts of genocide. The convention outlines between subparagraphs A to E that I've put on the screen, 5 acts of genocide. So this can include, for example, killing members of the group, but it also includes, which is, I think, quite relevant to forced labour, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. For genocide to be established, the perpetrator must have committed one of those 5 genocidal acts. Now, it's not sufficient simply to commit one of those genocidal acts. It must be accompanied with what is the second part, the intent to destroy. And this is where I start to really emphasize the flaws in international law and with the convention. So, for example, if a perpetrator was to kill members of the group, that would not be genocide unless it is established that they did so with the intention to destroy, in whole or in part, a protected group. And in the case of the Uyghurs, this would be an ethnic group. Now, that is an exceptionally high threshold to meet in law. And it has been, I believe, exceptionally restrictive in its application since the Holocaust. And I'll use Bosnia as a very quick example. In many parts of Bosnia, the ICTY did not make a finding of genocide because they could not establish the genocidal intent. They could establish genocidal acts. They could even establish that these acts constituted extermination as a crimes against humanity. They could not, however, in various municipalities, identify an intention to destroy and therefore could not make a determination of genocide. It is an exceptionally high threshold to meet. And I think the reason it becomes even more difficult in respect to forced labour is that the question in terms of genocide is not whether is forced labour being committed as part of a genocide. The question turns on how is forced labour being committed. And the reason being is forced labour must meet those 5 criteria, or one of those 5 criteria. So, for example, if you are in a situation of enslavement of a protected group, which caused serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, that will be genocide only if there was an intention to destroy. If you're absent with the intention to destroy, or for example, you're absent of the causing serious bodily or mental harm requirement, forced labour would not be required or would not make out genocide under the convention. So genocide, I think, is quite a difficult, hold on, there we go, difficult threshold to meet. But the question I think also turns is not just what is genocide, but what obligations come alongside a determination of it. When does the obligation to prevent and punish genocide arise, which is a duty on states within international law? Now, when it arises is not, contrary again to popular belief, after a genocide has occurred. Naturally, that would be absurd when the aim is prevention. The obligation to prevent, and I've put the quote from the relevant judgment from the Bosnia-Serbia case in 2007 on the screen, is where a state learns or ought to learn of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. So when we are considering the situation of the Uyghurs and state responsibility to prevent and punish genocide, we're not asking for a final determination. We're not asking for it to be applied retrospectively. The question is there a serious risk genocide will be committed? And I think that's important, as we'll come on to in the discussion when we can start to consider forced labour. But equally, what does the obligation to prevent and punish actually entail? It's not necessarily descript in the sense there aren't certain criteria which you have to meet to discharge that obligation to prevent and punish genocide. But again, it's from the same case, the Bosnia-Serbia case from 2007, the ICJ outlined that the obligation of state parties is one of conduct, not outcome. So whether or not you've discharged that obligation is whether or not a state has employed all means reasonably available to them so as to prevent genocide so far as possible. So the question is one of due diligence and it's one of conduct. And that is the obligation that is presently on states with genocide. Now, I would like to briefly, before I wrap up, just go on to consider forced labour in the wider context of other atrocity crimes. Naturally, in respect of the Uyghurs, we are talking about genocide, but I'd also like to talk about crimes against humanity, because there is a big difference between establishing it as a crime against humanity and genocide. Now, as I said with genocide, in being able to establish forced labour in international law would not amount to genocide by virtue of it being forced labour. It would have to be one of those five criterion with the requisite intent. It's not the same for crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity is a widespread or systematic attack against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. So there's no intention to destroy, that there's no destructive purpose behind the action. And crimes against humanity has a list of crimes which can amount to crimes against humanity, enslavement being one of them, and forced labour being a type of enslavement. So in terms of atrocity crimes more widely, if you can establish that forced labour is being undertaken and that it is being undertaken as a widespread or systematic attack, you are far more likely to establish that crimes against humanity rather than genocide is being perpetrated. The difficulty, however, in international law is there is not an obligation, like with genocide, to prevent crimes against humanity. That obligation simply does not exist. I'm conscious of time, so I'll come to a close now, but what I would really like to emphasise, and we could perhaps bring this on in the discussion, is that with enslavement in particular, although there isn't an obligation to prevent crimes against humanity, enslavement is a peremptory norm in international law. So that means that there is an obligation on states to prevent and prohibit enslavement. I won't go any further than that in terms of international law and domestic law around forced labour and modern slavery, and I'll wrap things up there. But as I said, if there are any questions involving international law throughout the rest of the talk, please do put those in the chat box to Mia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Raphael Lemkin, when he coined the phrase genocide, a Jewish Polish lawyer, he actually gave equal weight to the cultural destruction of a people as he did to the physical destruction. We just heard from Joe, unfortunately, the Convention for the Prevention of Genocide only gave way to the latter, at which point it's too late. But we also know muted myself, apologies. We also know that convention puts the responsibility on states. But nowadays, forced labor is not necessarily an enterprise that's led by states. It's led by companies. It's the Volkswagens and it's the Adidases and it's the big corporations that are implicit as much as the state is. And I'm just wondering, and I'm opening it up to all of our panelists, to what extent do these corporations have a responsibility to step in their decision-making, in the processes of accountability, and in making the tough choices of removing any of their production or the use of material that are sourced through forced labor? Whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I'm happy to begin from a legal point of view in any sense. I think responsibility is actually the key word you've used there rather than duty. Corporations in a legal sense aren't independent legal entities. They're not recognised as that in international law, and as such these obligations do not bind them in terms of the prevention of slavery and genocide and so forth. But there are nonetheless UN guiding principles for businesses and for corporations, and one of those is the respect for human rights. A lot of domestic legislatures have endeavoured to address this within their own domestic law, knowing that, as I said, international law would not apply in the same way to corporations. For example, in the UK, we have the Modern Slavery Act 2015. At the moment, that is just a reporting obligation. The purpose of it is to incorporate transparency. And actually, if I just may share my screen again, because I have got just the one section of the Modern Slavery Act on here. But as you said, Mia, the question comes to whether or not companies are prepared to address this. And I think evidence has shown us they're not. And the reason I have reservations with what is currently in law, particularly in the UK, and it's the same as I understand it in the US, is that these reporting obligations do not require companies to undertake any form of due diligence whatsoever. And the bit I'd emphasise is this bit I've highlighted at the bottom of the slide, is that companies where they do produce these statements, these reports, that report can include and be compliant with the law, a statement that the organisation has taken no such steps. So a company can be compliant with our present laws by saying we have done absolutely no due diligence whatsoever. I think responsibility is a key word to emphasise in terms of international law. I also believe that strengthening legal obligations is also something that should really give meat to that promise.
Thank you, Joe. Adrian?
Yes, I would like to emphasize that forced labor is an important component in financing the police state, in turning profits and making it sort of economically more feasible. Heavy-handed securitization has negatively impacted Xinjiang's economic situation and caused companies to leave. And with the forced labor and the labor transfer come heavy incentives and subsidies by the state. So companies who hire graduates or former detainees of internment camps get substantial subsidies per former detainee that they train and then employ. And also those who participate in the general labor transfer system enjoy substantial subsidies. There's some documents even indicate, completely free provision of factories. And so I think for us in the West, for companies, there's a strong moral obligation to not contribute to that in any way by having this in their supply chain, because the implications are you are helping to finance this ongoing atrocity in the police state.
Thank you, Adrian. Dieter, in the 1930s, we didn't have the sophisticated technology that many of the companies use today as part of their perpetration acts. But we do know that the Nazi system was very organized. Was forced labor as part of the racist ideology, was it perceived as a way not just of excluding Jews and other groups that you've identified, but was it identified as the process by which eventually the destruction of these groups would be secured?
Well, so certainly from 1939, 1940 onwards during the Second World War. Before the war, it had different purposes. One was exclusion, and another was, in inverted commas, re-education. It was humiliation. It was a tool to drive people out of the country, to make them immigrants. And then during the war, the purpose changed. It was part of the German war effort, the production in some of the ghettos and the forced labor camps and the transfer of concentration camp prisoners to Germany. That was all part of the war effort. And as David Cesarani, with some irony, has pointed out, the Shoah, the Holocaust, was carried out under-resourced and without any budget. And in that area, forced labor played a significant role, not only to fill the coffers to make profit for the big firms and the smaller firms and agriculture and for the German state, but also to enable the SS financially and logistically for mass murder and at the end for genocide as well.
Thank you. Before I open it up for questions from our participants, Rahima, you said that forced labor is not a new thing. It's only the scale that has changed, but it's also the knowledge that it's happening that has changed. The use of technology as a source of sharing information and evidence, Although eventually the UK Parliament only recently passed a motion to recognize the Uyghur genocide as genocide, there was too much convincing needed when it came to the corporate side of things, so the genocide amendment to the trade bill. I guess, where does it put us? Where does it put the government, where does it put companies in their choice to put profits over destruction, genocide, crimes against humanity? What are our challenges moving forward in that sense? Oh, you're muted, Rahima.
The host, okay. It said the host won't allow me to unmute. I tried several times. Well, I believe this is a very much moral, ethical issue, for the companies to think and relate themselves to the people like myself and people, the thousands are living. If you cannot relate yourself to the people over East Turkestan or the Uyghur region. This forced labor is actually causing families apart, children's being removed from families. And as Adrian said, this is facilitating this genocide, is financing the genocide. And it's up to the corporations. Of course, if we have a legal mechanism and, under the Genocide Convention, if the governments do accept and this is genocide is happening and, reconsider the trade agreement, the trade deals. But otherwise, the corporations should really consider their own reputation. I think they should consider about, for example, Volkswagen, for example, now, we know that it's a really terrible past, and what they are still remaining in Urumqi and refusing to leave, saying that they are not, as far as they know, there is no forced labor involved in their factory. How is it possible for you can make such kind of conclusion when there is no way you can do your audit? Everything is completely controlled by state, and no one can do any work, carry out any investigation independently. And when you know that there are millions of Uyghurs are locked up in camps and forced into forced labor, taken away 5,000, 6,000 kilometers away from home, and work in mainland China in factories, and they're subject to racism and bully from the Chinese people as well, because of the Chinese CCP propaganda portraying Uyghurs as malignant tumor and violent, backward. All this exposed the Uyghur to in a very vulnerable situation. And I would like to, these companies, the CEOs, they should really understand the extent of this suffering of the Uyghur people.
Thank you. I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. And the first one are two linked questions, I think, from Michael and Sabrina. And this is to all our panelists. How do we stop China? Considering the fact that it has veto power on a UN level, we learned about the weaknesses of the legal system. And I guess linked to that is the question, in which way can China be held accountable on its actions, considering these difficulties or these restrictions? Anyone want to have a go? Oh, we just had this conversation before the event started that there is a People's Tribunal, I think, happening this month already. Rahima, if you wanna, if you can elaborate a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yes, Uyghur Tribunal led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, I will be investigating the genocide. So from the 4th of June to the 8th, 4 days, there will be a hearing. The hearing will be taking place in Church House, not far from the House of Parliaments. Because of the COVID restrictions, maybe that we won't have a lot of witnesses come in person, but those who cannot give evidence in person, they will be giving evidence online. So I would encourage people to, this will be all live streamed in English and also in original language as well. And I would really encourage people to watch and listen to the survivors' accounts and also the accounts of the families living abroad that they have managed to obtain information about what happened to their loved ones. This include the children and being taken away and made to disappear, and also family and forced labor. All this mentioned in the reports, and we have also expert witnesses, and I believe Adrian Zenz will be one of them, and will give evidence.
I'm happy to sort of answer that question as well on the back of what Rahima has said as well, and actually the importance of determinations and the Uyghur Tribunal when it does produce its judgment. I think for the time being, in terms of accountability, we've seen the problems with either both the ICC and the ICJ. Simply neither court has jurisdiction because of China's position on the UN Security Council. There is, however, the option for a special tribunal to be established by the UN General Assembly. That is, of course, much more difficult, and it would require a diplomatic effort, which I think tribunals and state determinations play a part of. As after the motion you mentioned, Mia, about Parliament recognising that the Uyghurs are suffering genocide and crimes against humanity, we've seen similar motions now, or will be put forward before parliaments in Germany, Italy, and so forth. So there is, as it were, this snowball effect where states are starting to stand up and say, we are recognising what's going on. And so long as you keep that snowball effect going, the closer you become, I think, to holding them accountable via the General Assembly. The second thing I think is important in terms of forced labour is actually the relationship corporations have with forced labour themselves. I think the problem arises, as I've said, corporations don't have these legal duties upon them, and they're not in all instances necessarily perpetrating the crime themselves. They are benefiting from either a state actor or a local non-state actor committing the crime and then benefiting from the profits of forced labour. That's how it sort of embeds itself within the supply chain. And as I said only a moment ago, with no legal obligation to undertake any form of human rights due diligence, companies simply will not either investigate supply chains or be held accountable in those supply chains. And along ago and ago and again and again and again, we see this sort of almost cycle of impunity, as it were, with states exploiting those in situations because either they turned a blind eye or simply refuse to do anything when information is presented to them because they're not obliged to do so. So I think both of those angles should be considered, both the responsibility of the state and corporations, and I think in tandem and in time, they would have an effect.
Thank you, Joe. And I think that also answers one of the questions from Josh, who's also a René Cassin alumni. And it was about the effective measures that the UK government could take to better address forced labour in Xinjiang and other regions, including measures that could greatly reduce private sector companies' involvement in those regions. And In fact, it was Dominic Raab that brought in the Modern Slavery Act initially as, I guess, the British response to the issue. I would argue it's insufficient, but that too was used as a tool. Graham has recently completed some research on the Uyghur persecution and concludes that there is no genocide and no forced sterilization. There are many Islamic temples in Xinjiang and evidence for Uyghur, I guess, culture. Could Adrian go through the sources of evidence?
Sure. Sorry, could you briefly state again what that publication was again?
It doesn't say. I think it's independent research.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's research completed by the person, making the point.
The question.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is a very comprehensive evidence, for example, on the destruction of mosques and other religious cultural sites, evaluated by an expert, Ryan Thum, who is an expert on Uyghur religion, and evidenced by satellite evidence. So, but that's not my area of expertise. There is very comprehensive effort by Xinjiang scholars, by different researchers, by think tanks, and by media outlets to bring together different forms of evidence. And for me, it's very important that we always have a picture of triangulation. So for example, we have actual witnesses, human witnesses, who we have satellite images have been very important, played a very important role in the analysis. We have Chinese documents, which is my specialty. So in terms of my sources, I look at different types of Chinese documents, which I then also triangulate among themselves, but also to other sources. So for example, we have government directives or reports or budgets. We have them at the regional level, at the prefecture level, at county levels, at lower levels. We have a very important for me on my works also to have like propaganda accounts. Oftentimes a propaganda account, for example, of a cotton picker or of somebody from a camp or parent-child separation. You read between the lines of propaganda accounts what they say, because they can actually provide very valuable and factual information if you read them in context. We then have budgets, for example. We then have other government reports, recruitment notices. There's a wealth of information that comes together, and sometimes one gets sort of real gems in terms of like a leaked confidential document, classified document, which then of course has to be authenticated. And for example, for the China cables and the Karakash list, we underwent a very extensive authentication, which we then documented. There's a lot of efforts at the moment to discredit the research and to sort of just uncritically repeat Chinese government propaganda, such as the numbers of mosques, which is meaningless. If you look, for example, at testimony of, well, how many people actually can go to a mosque? What happens to people if they practice religion? What have we seen of happening to mosques? Eyewitness, for example, the notable British academic Joanne Smith-Finlay visited Xinjiang in 2018 or 19. Photographed entrances of mosques, looked at the situation. Diplomats have been visiting, journalists have been visiting, of course, are harassed quite severely. So I think a lot of the attempts to try to discredit this whole evidence is either trying to discredit people who do the research, and then they often ignore others who have done research. For example, a lot of research, not just done by myself, there's a whole range of other scholars who have worked on the region for a long time. Or they just try to discredit, oh, it's just a think tank publication or something. But there's actually peer-reviewed publications as well. And of course, you want to look at the evidence on the basis of its merit. But the biggest thing is, of course, when it comes to really tricky things, for example, accounts that try to deny mass sterilization, for example, not one of them has actually engaged with the smoking gun evidence of the documents that talk about mass sterilization, not one of them. And the reason for that is, of course, that these are very sensitive. So that'd be a very short reply to that question. You are muted.
I'm muted. Tom has a question. Is appeasement ever a necessary option? Dieter, I see you.
Yeah. ask historians in the UK about appeasement, and you have three views at least. No, I don't think it's an option. I don't think it's an option, and I really wonder how much can be done on governmental level, how much can be done by politicians. I think it's to come back to the very first question. It is important to blame and to shame everybody involved, and to keep doing that. And maybe as consumers, we must be more sensitive. So I have to start with myself. So I naively ordered an Apple computer a while ago, and then I could track and was surprised that it was delivered from Shanghai, and here we are. But on a more general side, a pair of trousers or a t-shirt for £5 or £10 or €10 must be suspicious. It is not possible to produce it with well-paid and honestly and fair-paid labor. It is not possible. And maybe that's where we can all start to change consumer behavior. Appeasement, that question, I've doubt that appeasement was ever successful. It might have extended peace for a while, but at the end there was the Second World War.
Thank you.
Well, if I can add, I mean, appeasement tends to embolden the perpetrator of a crime. And if there's no cost imposed on perpetrating an atrocity, then why not continue? I think we need to look at the motivation. Why is the Chinese state doing this? And if we look at the motivation, I think it's quite clear that one has to counter it and exact a cost, either in the form of sanctions, divestment from forced labor, etc.
Thank you. Adrian, I think you have a couple of questions addressed to you. You should have them on your chat.
Yes, a question. The Chinese authorities say Xinjiang enjoys peace and prosperity. Have I been there, and what did I see? So my research, even though I have done extensive fieldwork in China, it was not in Xinjiang, and I am in that sense not a Xinjiang specialist, but I've become a Xinjiang specialist in a methodology that I pioneered by looking at government documents, recruitment documents, etc. But it's of course very important to see that my work does not stand by itself, but there have been numerous academics, diplomats and journalists who have visited Xinjiang. And of course, we do have the witnesses who come out of it. The witnesses who come out of Xinjiang paint a very different picture from Chinese propaganda. And I think we have abundant material that makes it very clear that this propaganda is highly questionable. Are there lists of companies benefiting from forced labor so consumers can take responsibility is not a question. And here I would point to the Coalition to End Uyghur Forced Labor. They have a website if you Google it. And yeah, there's a bit of a shifting ground. Of course, there's a lack of research. So we know a lot about forced labor, and especially with cotton picking, there's a really big one. But then from there, to develop a list of companies who have supply relationships, that's quite complicated. And of course, many are actually implicated. So I think an approach would actually to start to write to companies and ask them. There's not enough requirement for supply chain transparency, and that's very concerning. I don't know if Rahima would like to add to that.
Okay, yeah, I can't unmute for some reason. People often asking these questions, they believe that sometime after watching the propaganda, and then they have this kind of dilemma. Just imagine me, you know, I left my country in 2000 and I never returned. I have 9 siblings and extended family that, you know, I can't see them. I know many many people who had really good career, who are well educated, but you know, when they find an opportunity, left, because knowing that situation was getting just worse day by day. When I left in 2000, people were already desperate, really, really desperate to leave the country, but it was extremely difficult to obtain a passport. For Uyghurs, normally you have to like wait 6 months to 1 year. And then in 2015, they said, well, we are giving you, relaxing the passport application. And so they give mass number of Uyghurs passports, and then they traveled to Turkey on return, all arrested. Now these people are all in camps because they traveled to these 26 blacklisted countries. And I always wonder whether that was actually pre-planned. And the documentary that I worked undercover inside China's digital gulag, I worked as a consultant and interpreter. A Chinese reporter, undercover Chinese reporter, went to Urumqi, met some government officials pretending to be business person. And there is one scene I would encourage people to watch. And this Chinese official said, the government is exaggerating the threat and just arresting the Uyghurs. When Uyghur people ask to hand over their phone, and if they question why, they just take them away. So when the undercover reporter asked him, don't you think the Uyghurs feel their human rights are being violated? And this official said, it's not about violating their rights, they just don't have human rights. And there's another official also in a bar while drinking beer, and he said, I believe the state has to build a lot of mental hospitals, because when these people are released, they're not going to be normal. So these are from the party officials, unguarded, they said, their statements. And of course, the Chinese propaganda videos, always the Uyghurs are singing and dancing. And this morning when I was speaking to a radio, Salam Radio from Johannesburg, they also asked me this question. And I just suddenly remembered that the Xinjiang's book, the famous writer who wrote A Wild Swan and Unknown Story of Mao. And there is one scene about during the Cultural Revolution, how the CCP Red Guards killed so many Tibetans, and after burying them and forcing the women to dance there. And this just a kind of reminder, they take away your children and then force you to smile, force you to sing, and force you to dance, and force you on these confession videos, and denounce own loved ones who are fighting for justice abroad. So this system, this regime is cruel. There is no bottom line when it comes to cruelty.
I'm conscious of time, and I know there are a few more questions, and I will share René Cassin's details, contact details, and Joe and Adrian and Rahima, if you want to, you can do that as well. At the risk of sounding very cliche, history repeats itself. Dieter, you described what history looked like in the 1940s, and we know where it ended. It ended in the genocide of 6 million Jews and other groups at the time. We know what China is doing today. We know about the forced labor, the forced sterilization, the cultural attempt to eradicate any existence of the Uyghur language, Uyghur traditions, Uyghur way of life. But we have a chance now, and we can act. this is where the call to action comes in. And I just want to give you a very small example. René Cassin is a campaigning organization, and we've been campaigning on the campaign on ending Uyghur persecution for over 2 years, part of which was really challenging companies, garment companies as part of the call to action. 89 companies today have operations in Xinjiang region or use Uyghur forced labor. And one of our supporters wrote to his favorite shirt company, wrote directly to the CEO to ask, are the shirts I'm wearing sourced by from cotton coming from Xinjiang region or Uyghur forced labor? And it was a long process of conversation. That company today, as of July 2021, will stop sourcing cotton not only from Xinjiang region, but from China in producing their shirts. Now, it could be that it's that one supporter that started that process. It could be thousands like him. But, you know, to coin Tesco's, every little helps. And I think if every one of us makes the individual conscious decisions, from challenging companies like Volkswagen or making our experience down the high street slightly different in terms of the choices we make, then change can happen. I mean, Adrian, you said forced labor is paying for the police state and the police regime that the CCP is operating in China. So let's make it hurt where it hurts the most, if that's where we can affect change. I'm going to share a link now in the chat box, a recent initiative that René Cassin launched. It focuses not only on Volkswagen, but if you go in, you'll see other companies that are named that could and should be challenged for their involvement in forced labor and Uyghur persecution. I would like to thank our panelists, Adrian, Dieter, Joe, Rahima, for sharing your knowledge, sharing your experience with us. It's been a very profound learning process, I think. And it's challenging. It's challenging all of us. Complicit behavior is unacceptable. And we do not want to be part of that complicit, I think, environment or approach that enables the ultimate annihilation of a people and their culture. Because we know we are speakers by experience, whether directly or indirectly, of when that happens and the implications it has. I want to thank Barbara and the Wiener Library for co-hosting this with us. And really, it's the then and now narrative. If we don't learn from then, we will never change the now. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and add your voice to action and challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.